Welcome to another podcast, video blog in our series, Conversations in Practical Theology, with me, Eric Stoddart, and my colleague, Saiyyidah Zaidi. We were going to talk today about class, but I think it's a broader issue than just a narrow segment of class issues. So we're going to try and broaden that out a bit to think about the different ways in which we're sort of categorized, how we categorize ourselves, how we categorize other people, how we attach ourselves to networks, to tribes in our society. And we'll come on to class, but it just seemed as we were chatting before we set this recording going, that class was just too narrow a definition. So let me kick off, Saiyyidah. I'm trying to think, what sort of tribes am I associated with? There's clearly the academic tribe. I could talk about white male tribe. I could talk about the Scottish tribe. I could narrow it a bit more and talk about the Edinburgh tribe, but it's multiple tribes with which school you went to. And I'm an incomer because I've only been here 19 years and I grew up 110 miles up the road. So I'm not really part of the Edinburgh tribe. Do you think tribe is at all a useful term to think about where we place ourselves and make who we are in society?
Yeah, it's a really interesting kind of introduction there, because I think the word tribe clearly has a historical context and a historical meaning. But when we look at how social media now operates, I think that the word tribe has come back because there's a common usage now of the word tribe in social media, in groups of people that have come together through those various means. So I think it is a word that is useful. The question then is, how do we take that and put that into our, I suppose, our living real life here, our physical lives? And I think it is something that is worth considering. But sometimes when one puts themselves into a tribe or into a grouping, then I think there's also a kind of othering of others. And the challenge then is how do you associate with a particular tribe or group and not alienate or other somebody else?
Yeah, but isn't the very nature of how we function as human beings, we create clusters. We are part of families, we make other forms of family, we have groups of friends, and by calling one person or even a group of people our friends, the others are not our friends. And there's almost not an alternative. We can't be friends with everybody. So we're making choices. But I get your point about the alienation that can cause. Because maybe, certainly going back to primary school or secondary school, if you end up in the wrong social group, you get alienated from all the ones where the exciting things are happening or interesting things are happening. So othering is painful, but is there an alternative?
I think for me, it comes down to how do we treat human beings generally. So for example, in the last sermon of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings upon him, he said, Arab is no better than non-Arab, black is no better than white. And then there are other kind of hadiths, sayings of the Prophet and other references within the Quran, which talk about how status comes from piety. And, of course, the word piety can be unpacked in so many different ways, but it comes from, the application of the rules. And, I would say that one of the most fundamental rules of Islam is to love your neighbor and to think about your neighbor. And what's really fascinating for me is that Islamically, the definition of neighbor is not just the person that's to the left and to the right of you. It's 40 streets to the left and 40 streets to the right, and front and back as well. So actually that's then the creation of a community. And I mean, alienation is a strong word, but when we think about ourselves within a group, so for example, people would look at me and they would say, I belong to the Muslim group, I belong to the female tribe group, I am of a person of colour, but maybe some people can't quite place me, and so when we look at other people and we try and identify what tribe or group they're from, it's also about our own comfort and how we can then relate to that other person. And I think if it's done with the intention of love thy neighbour, then that's fantastic. If it's done with the intention of alienation, then I think we have a major problem.
I love this idea of having the expansiveness of everyone being our neighbour, because you share that from the Gospels as well. But yet the particular importance of that, that's so wonderful, but it doesn't connect with real people. And so the actual people that we connect with, as you say, to be loving, to be caring for actual individuals, means finding things in common with them, means trying to understand what we share, what things we can talk about, where we've got interests. And that sort of grouping, tribe, category can make that actually possible, because it creates connections rather than pushes others away.
I agree, but I think that human beings have an inordinate capacity for love, and I think this really became apparent to me in the summer this year, because I attended a week-long intensive and left that feeling as if I had now got a new family. And I didn't actually realize that I had that kind of capacity to love even more people. So we make a conscious decision whether we care or not care about individuals. And I'm not saying that, we have any infinite capacity to support and nurture and everything, unlimited people. So there are probably layers to this. And so the immediate group or tribe that you would care for is probably going to be your friends and family, and then I think there are layers to that. But if God brings somebody into our lives, then that person has been brought in for a reason, I think. And it could be to teach us a lesson, it could be to remind us of something, and it could just be because we have the capacity to assist that person in whatever way, tiny way it could be. And opening yourself up to that, I think I think that's kind of God's work.
The opening up to that person that comes across our path, that there are split-second decisions that we make in first impressions, and that freaks me out, because I know I do it like everybody else to other people, and then if I stop and think about what people's first impressions are of me, that is just paralyzing. But it's how we sort of functioning as human beings. We got to have a quick assessment. Is this person a threat? Are they safe to then have another conversation with, or to engage with? And that's a very primitive reaction. But being open to, use that phrase, being open, and that seems to capture the first impression with intention of being open.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still working on it. I think we're all working on it. But I think just having that attitude means that you can have richer experiences, I think. you know, because, you know, in the Quran, it says, you know, we have made you into nations and tribes so that you may get to know one another. And I just love that kind of description, because some of my richest experiences have been through travel, and it's through doing things that I would never have done in my life, but it's the custom of another group or another tribe, and then that teaches you just something really rich, and I don't know, it just makes you feel good. Also, it helps one to then decide whether they want to stay in a particular tribe, or if there are new ways of doing things that you might want to adopt.
But how do you get past the first impressions that are just there in a split second?
You know, I think, and that's a really important question. I think that human beings all have prejudice, and I think that we would be naive to think that we don't. Acknowledging your own prejudices is probably one of the hardest things that you can do in life, but realizing that and then working where the resistance is probably a real challenge. But when you do that, then I think that's when you really demonstrate maturity, you know.
Yeah, because there is a natural reaction often to be suspicious, and the sort of academic work I do about surveillance and everything is all about suspicion. It's all about starting from a point that the stranger is a threat, and we've got to quantify that threat and got to react responsibly. Maybe it'll turn out that the person isn't a threat, but let's assume that they are a threat. And that, to me, seems just such a widespread perspective in society. I notice it myself. But
I think you're right, but I think it's not a very theological approach to humanity, you know. And I think if we take what you just said and apply it for real, then that's why we have so many problems in the world today. I think because I don't want to approach people with suspicion, you know. I don't think that is what any of the religions teach us. That is what has happened as a result of politics and companies, and you know, it's a reactive response to things that have happened. Now, I'm not saying that there should be no surveillance or no security. I think that we need that given the complications of life today. I find it really quite shocking that people will approach others with suspicion, because I don't know, could I go as far as saying that that's unholy? I don't know.
I think you're right. In both our faith traditions, that disposition to be open to the other it fights against the human capacity or tendency to be suspicious, because I certainly know that's my natural disposition, is to just sort of wait and see, to be suspicious is sometimes too strong a word, but just cautious. But there's a lot in my own Christian tradition about reaching out, and the example of Jesus, who, in the face of a lot of criticism from others, reached out over the boundaries of suspicion to people with diseases, people with various mental, demonic conditions of the time, and culturally he was reaching out over many boundaries.
He spoke to women, which was a really shocking thing in the time.
Yes, yeah, and in whichever part of society those boundaries are there, the examples of our religious forebears to be reaching out over those. But it is the point, I think, where that clashes with an innate human tendency, and it's about choice.
Yeah, I think we have a choice that we're making about how we want to be in society, and if if you make a decision just to belong only to your group or your tribe and not to interact with others, then you're self-alienating and you're creating problems for you and for your group. You know, I mean, it's funny, I was watching something on the Amish the other day, and whilst we may think of them as a community that is quite enclosed, actually they allow others to come in and interact with them and to see their way of life. So sometimes the kind of protection of a tribe and a group that adheres to certain rules, you know, it's clearly very, very important to them. And I cite them just as one group. I'm trying to think of others, but I can't at the moment. But allow, you know, kind of having an interaction with others is really, really important. And if we don't do that, I think you don't have the opportunity to then kind of, you know, get to know one another.
And maybe there's something about the group, the unit, tribe, whatever, that gives a security for reaching out, because it's really difficult to do that just as an individual. And I think our identity comes from being social, and that's who we are. It's what we are as human beings. But that can give a great security for reaching out over the boundaries rather than being just an individual who's doing that.
Yes and no. I mean, it's really funny because I mean, I think London is a melting pot of lots of different groups and tribes and communities. And so my experience here would say that even as an individual, you represent yourself. So I can kind of understand what you're saying about the protection of the community, but that also completely disappears because when one is fighting to get onto the tube and there's no space, then it's, you know, it literally can become quite, you know, it can become a little bit like a zoo, you know. So that then shifts from it being within a community setting to being very individualistic. And I suppose, you know, dressing like I dress, the minute that I leave my door, people will see me as an individual that belongs to a tribe or a group, but they won't necessarily, yeah, I mean, I wonder how people do judge and pigeonhole.
Yeah, because that's a really useful English phrase, isn't it? The metaphor of being pigeonholed, because it has all sorts of negative connotations about this is how people are going to read me, this is where they're putting me, these are their expectations of me, simply because they've either heard my accent or they've seen the colour of my skin or they've seen what I wear, and then I'm pigeonholed. That I don't think it's ever something that maybe we don't do to ourselves. Is it something that's always done to us?
I think sometimes it's easy to do to ourselves, especially actually when we're doing reflexivity, you know, because we're then saying, I belong to this and I am this and I'm so the kind of pigeonholing, I suppose, gets smaller and smaller and more focused. And the awareness of that, I think, is quite useful. And the hierarchy as well in which we put ourselves. Just as a bit of an aside, at the weekend I was attending kind of like a little conference with Christians and Muslims, and we were speaking about pagan worship. And I said, well, to some degree, are we all not pagan worshippers or idol worshippers now? Because what do we think of when we wake up in the morning? Is it God or our phone? And I mentioned that because even doing something like that is kind of, you know, putting people into a group, you know. And it's a question, I have to say, it's a question I'm asking myself just as much as I'm asking everyone else, because of the way that our relationship with God is changing, you know, and it's constantly moving, I think, certainly for me. Now, is asking that question putting people into a group, or is it actually just kind of like putting something philosophical out there?
Yeah, it's how we put people into a group. Maybe it's back to that. Are we doing that in order to be able to reach out over that boundary? I like the idea that when you brought in reflexivity in practical theology, where we're consciously trying to understand our own position, where we're coming from, why we're coming from, why we're reading a situation in a particular way, and integrating that into our theology. And you've just said something that makes me wonder, how different is that from navel gazing and pigeonholing ourselves? That, I'm this, that, and the other as a practical theologian, so I look at things in this, that, and that other way. Okay, and then we move on to the bit of our writing. But how are we blocking ourselves sometimes with those categories, even within practical theology, or maybe especially within practical theology, when we make ourselves conscious of our standpoint and vantage and tribes and all of that? Is it becoming perhaps sometimes a block? I'm going to have to think about that.
Yeah, and are we pretending to be something that we're really not?
Oh, pretending which tribe we're in. Yes, yes. Trying to be one thing. And that brings back horrible memories of school. Trying to be in the in-group and failing all the time. Never knowing what was the right music. Never listening to the right things. Never reading the right books. Never being able to play the right sports to the particular standard that was needed either at primary or secondary school. And wanting to be part of groups that were sort of aspirational but didn't quite make it. Ugh, that's horrible memories.
I mean, it makes me think, does it really matter? Because it's easier, I think, for society if we put ourselves in groups. But I think that restricts the freedom that we desire as humans. And so I don't know. I mean, I understand that we are in tribes and groups, and I also know that people put us in there. But I kind of also like the freedom of not being in one, and people not being able to place me, and breaking boundaries, and just kind of I don't think being anonymized is the right thing, but just being able to kind of belong to lots of different groups and things.
Yeah, and we're basically constructing who we are, and we're making choices about the groups. And maybe that's fine if there's groups that we can be part of. But if there are groups that we want to be part of but we're excluded from, and that maybe comes back to class, that if there are things about the family tradition you've been born into, that the class distinction, you're going to have access to groups that others of us are simply not going to be able to get near, because we don't have the family tradition, we don't have the money, we don't have the geographical location, we don't have the network of connections. And something like class was certainly traditionally a way of keeping us all in our place.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I think there's other things as well that kind of put people in their place as well. So this whole thing about, were you educated at a Russell Group university? Did you go to private school or public school? And some of these things have become more accessible, but even to gain entry, you've got to reach a certain group or a certain status. And I know, for me, for example, I'm very privileged in many respects in that I live in London, because it's a major city and we have access to things that others don't. So perhaps the kind of real challenge here when it comes to tribes and groups is one of the status and the things that it affords you.
Yeah, and what you can afford, and in an actual sense of money, to be part of. Because if it's about going to certain places, certain cultural activities, wearing certain clothes, being in certain places, that costs money. And if you don't have that, you can be really excluded from the conversations, from the decision making. And that's a bit of class, it's a bit about social justice and enabling people to have, so the opportunities are not limited to one particular cluster of networks or tribes, to somehow broaden out the opportunities.
I think it's also to do with how you think, because when you can see that it's possible to kind of, do social climbing or whatever it might be called, and you see that there are other opportunities that are out there, then it does broaden your horizon and you have more choice. And I think choice is limited for a lot of people because, I was lucky. When I was at school, we were taken to go and see an opera. I would have never seen an opera otherwise. I mean, I don't like opera, but I'm really, really glad that I had the chance to go, to be able to experience it for myself, to be able to make a decision, right? And I'd say the same about ballet. And some people don't even have the opportunity to go to the cinema, And so when we were growing up, I don't think I went to the cinema until I was about 15, 16, when I got a job, because then it was something that I could afford to do. And these are kind of everyday experiences for some people, but then experiences that many people can't have. And I think, does that say something about society? I mean, what are we talking about here?
I'm not a great fan of Victorians generally, but some things they got spot on. And public libraries, just capturing what you were talking about the opportunities for culture, for learning, and the whole concept of the public library, where there seem to be so many stories of young people who positioned themselves in a seat in the public library as kids, and they read and read, and they became effective social activists, politicians. They changed society, and they came from roots that they would never otherwise have had the opportunity. Yes, they were at school, but there were such limited resources at school. But the idea of a public library system and free museums and free art galleries that just allow folks who can't afford, like I can, to pay an admission fee, they should have the option of choice to see those beautiful things, to be stimulated like I can be with the culture, with history, and it shouldn't have to depend on your income. And the Victorians were spot on with that. I know it was very paternalistic and it was a sort of top-down approach, but it was a good thing, and we seem to be losing that now with so few public libraries. I saw someone write one of these memes about the public libraries, about the last place in the country where you're not expected to go in and buy something.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that if we lose our public libraries, we're losing far more than just access to books.
Yeah, I agree entirely, and it worries me that the kind of divisions that are taking place today are it's such a basic level, are people that are going to food banks a new tribe? Are the homeless a tribe that society is working really, really hard? I'm talking about generally, society is working really hard to ignore. And there are certain groups and tribes that should not exist, because we as a human population should be supporting each other, and it's about decision making that is way above our pay grade, but someone should be, being very, very conscious and making the right choices.
Yeah, and you're touching there on fundamental issues of social justice.
Yeah.
about the construction through political decisions of what become networks, groups, user groups, client groups, whatever the current buzzword is, that are that people are being forced into, not necessarily through their own choice at all, but through circumstances and systemic injustice, and getting one foot onto a spiral of poverty that is so difficult to get off of. And what that then means in terms of wider opportunities, it just, I think, having come, from a working class background myself, and being pretty much the first in certainly my own immediate family to go to university, the cousin who'd managed to go to university. But this was not something that was part of our family tradition over the years. It was very working class, and being able to have opportunities. Now, that was the late 60s, the early 70s, and the opening up of education beyond grammar schools, and that really sort of beginnings of trying to open up opportunity for people. And I'm so grateful that I was born in that period. I don't know what would have happened, if I was born 30 years later, at the height of Thatcherism, or now in the height of austerity. That's a very different thing about the tribes that I could be part of.
Yeah, and it's really, really challenging, I think, today, because some of these things that you're touching on, we don't have the answers to. And I'm wondering if that's a good kind of time to bring this discussion to a close, because there is value, I think, in discussing austerity and some of the new emerging challenges that we face as a society. But I think in terms of grouping and identifying ourselves as tribes and groups, that's something that people are doing to themselves. It's something that society is doing as well. And I think there's a lot for us to really reflect on as individuals in terms of how do we see ourselves, which groups do we belong to, and which groups do others see us as part of as well. So I want to thank you for watching and listening and participating as well. We love to hear your comments. So if you have learned something, if you've gained an insight, please do comment below this particular conversation, and hopefully we will see you in another conversation in practical theology very, very soon. Goodbye.
And goodbye from me also. Bye-bye.